You've been thinking about it all night long, all through dinner. You're sitting across from them close enough to catch their scent. The conversation is going where conversations go, but underneath it, there's something else. You see it in their eyes and they see it in yours too. By the time you're finally alone and the door is closed, your clothes are already on the floor. Skin against skin, heat, hands, urgency, passion. Most of us haven't felt like that in a long time, and a lot of us are still wondering why. Hey, lovers. This is Sex in Real Life. Honest conversations about sex and relationships beyond 40. I'm your host, Stacey Herrera. I had a conversation once with a man who was seriously considering leaving his marriage. It wasn't that his wife stopped loving him. They hadn't really grown apart. She loved him. She was very, very clear in expressing that. And she was attracted to him. And she still wanted to have sex, just not every day. They were having sex about 2 or 3 nights a week. And he was approaching 60. She was in her mid-50s. And he was telling me that he might need to find someone else because his wife couldn't handle his stamina. So I asked him how often he actually wanted sex. Not how much he thought about it, but how much he actually felt pulled to do it. And he said, sometimes, but he wanted her to want it every day. He didn't necessarily want to have it every day, but he wanted her to want it. I don't think that he really had thought about what he had said to me. He hadn't heard himself articulate it before. So he wasn't describing a sex problem. He was describing longing. He was longing for a particular feeling. He wanted to be wanted with urgency, He wanted to feel that heat, like I described at the beginning. And because that wasn't present in the relationship, he decided that if she didn't feel that for him every single day, that the marriage wasn't going to last. When he kept talking, I discovered that they hadn't had sex every day for more than a decade. So, it was like 20 years. They had been together for more than 20 years. And so what he was describing that he wanted had happened early in the relationship. It was a different time, And now he's approaching 60, and the memory of what it used to be like is now the standard in his mind. That's what he's measuring everything against. So having sex 2 to 3 times a week with a woman that clearly loved him and wanted him was not the same thing. We learn about sex in young bodies. That's just the reality of it. Those first experiences are formative. They are the blueprint. That's what we use as a reference point for what sex is and what it feels like. And even when it's, those very first times are not great usually. They might feel good, but, it takes a while to kind of, get in the rhythm of things. But yet and still, that early sexual experience is the blueprint. And so we think about like the insistent, almost involuntary, spontaneous desire that we feel. And that's the sex that gets remembered. That's what we use as a definition. So when people start talking about the used tos, there's so many variations of used tos. We used to have sex every day. We used to be all over each other. We used to have good sex. I used to have more orgasms. I used to want it more, But underneath all of that used to stuff is the same reference point, the urgency, the spontaneity. But mostly that's just hormones. Mostly that's just hormones. And we don't really understand that when we're young. That involuntary heat is just, chemistry. You feel a thing and you think a thing, your body makes a cocktail, floods your brain makes a cocktail, floods your whole body with it, and that becomes the baseline, right? So the man considering divorce, he wasn't really grieving his marriage. He was grieving biology. He was thinking about the kind of wanting that happened in the younger bodies that he and his wife had, that neither of them can return to because, aging doesn't work like that. But he didn't have a framework for that reality. So the story he built around it was that something is wrong, and that needed to be fixed. And that's the thing about the used tos. Most of the time, it's not an accurate account of something that's been lost. It's just a signal that something changed. Your body is different, the way you experience desire for yourself or how you experienced being desired, it changes. The conditions are different. And the only reference point you have was written in the earliest point in your sexual experience in that young body. But like I said before, desire is largely hormonal when you're young. There's no schedule. It just is, it's spontaneous. It just flushes you all of a sudden. But when you get older and the hormones change, desire is more emotional. It's responsive rather than spontaneous. It needs something to grow in, you know, connectivity, attentiveness, feeling safe and secure, feeling seen. That's the difference. And when would we know that about ourselves, right? Like, when would we know that about ourselves? It's not because we don't pay attention. We're paying attention as best we can, but when everything changes, it's easy to latch on to what it used to feel like. And that's the thing about nostalgia. And nostalgia is real, and longing is real, and wanting to feel some kind of way, clothes on the floor, and wanting to be wanted so bad that the feelings take over before you have a chance to think about it, right? Like, that's real. And it makes sense and it feels wonderful. But what you're actually longing for is more complicated than that, because you're probably not missing the sex that you had. You're missing the idea of it, because that's what's embedded in your memory. And that came through in this younger body. That early relationship electricity, that novelty that inevitably changes, the version of you that felt so alive that it felt compulsive, risk and not yet knowing, that kind of attention that comes with being new to each other, right? Because, even in an older body, you can get a glimpse of that when something is new. But when you've been together with someone for a long time, and the sex that started was in younger, different bodies, it's easy to not realize that. But what if what you're actually longing for is that feeling of being new to someone? You know, what if that's it? You want to have the kind of sex that happens on in the middle of the week when you weren't planning on doing it. It's just feeling your way through. And even if in a new situation, you never get to feel it the way you felt it the first time. But that's true about everything, right? So, like, chasing it and measuring everything against something that happened so long ago, and then building a whole narrative around what's been lost, it just keeps you from being able to see what's really there right now, which, might be different. The conditions are different, but that doesn't mean it's not good. So, back to the man considering divorce. I mean, he wasn't wrong because things had changed. He changed, she changed, but the framework hadn't changed. So, with the existing scaffolding inside of his mind, the only thing there is loss, about what his wife didn't want him and from him in the same way, about a marriage that was still functional, but he felt like he needed to find someone to give him back that feeling. I mean, 2 to 3 times a week with someone who loves you and thinks you're hot still that's kind of great, right? But it didn't feel like that to him because he was measuring it against what was. It was being measured against a memory of something that had happened decades ago and that was emotionally fueled. And that's what happens when we get stuck in the used to, right? Because it takes the present and it measures it against the past, and the past always wins in comparison because memory is selective and nostalgia has a way of keeping up with heat, and things that punctuate really hard, but it kind of drops everything else. Just something to think about. If this resonated with you on any level, share it with a friend, post it on socials, text it, just pass it along. I hope that you are already following the show so that new episodes show up in your feed. And if you feel inclined, a 5-star rating and a short review helps us to find more ears to listen. Next week, we're going to talk about intimacy. I mean, that's what we were talking about in this episode, too, if you didn't get that. But next week, we're going to talk about intimacy through a different lens. See you then. Ciao.